is Kavya, and I lead capacity building and training for the crisis and disaster risk financing team at the World Bank. And I will be your host over the next 2 hours. So today we have a very exciting event planned for you. The event is in two parts, and in the first part, what we will be doing is having short taster presentations on different topics related to risk financing and assessment. So these are going to be paired presentations where we'll have the first speaker present a concept and the second speaker talk about how this concept is operationally implemented. That's going to be the first 1 hour of today's event, after which we will break out into small group discussions, and all of you will have the opportunity to interact with the speakers who presented and deep dive into the presentations and talk a little more about the case studies presented today. Please do remember that the main session will be recorded. So I just wanted to let everybody know ahead of time. So before we dive into the details on risk assessment, we have our first speaker today, Sumati Rajput, who's going to take us through the importance of risk financing and assessment. And she will set the baseline for today's session. Sumati is a financial sector specialist who also works at the Crisis and Disaster Risk Financing team at the World Bank Group. She co-manages the Global Risk Financing Facility, a $200 million program that supports developing countries to prearrange financial solutions in advance of climate shocks, disasters, and other crises. And as part of her operational work, she works in the Africa region to embed financial solutions for macro-fiscal shocks across sectors, particularly through World Bank projects focused on disaster risk management, financial planning, and social protection. So without much further ado, I hand over to Sumati, who's going to set the scene for the rest of today.
Thanks, Kavya. Hi, everyone. In the spirit of understanding risk, where it's all about trying to communicate complex things simply, the next 5 minutes are going to be a little bit different from what you're usually used to seeing. So to get started, this is about how risk assessments can inform financial planning. Now, we all probably do the same kind of basic fifth grade math while planning our finances. For me, this means trying to understand the difference between how much I make and how much I spend every month. Basically, how much do I get as a monthly income and what do I owe in terms of rent, utilities, my credit card bill. What this basic fifth grade math does is in fact quite valuable. It provides me the information I need about the surplus funds that I have left to plan some nice holidays, buy some expensive shoes, all these things that I don't actually need, but that bring me a lot of happiness. But if you're a smart planner, which let's face it, most of us are not, you probably also want to consider things like, what am I going to do if something goes wrong and I have to pay for things that I haven't actually planned for and budgeted for? Now, to consider this last question, somebody like me would ask myself a few more questions. What is it that's there's something wrong that could happen? Maybe I develop a health-related issue that my insurance doesn't cover, which then drains my finances. Or maybe I make some bad investment decisions that then wipe out a chunk of my income. Now, 11th grade math taught me that some things have a higher likelihood of happening than others, the art of probabilities, right? So this makes me think that if I don't have a health-related issue, then chances are that I'm less likely to suffer from a life-threatening illness. However, because I religiously invest in the stock market, I'm more likely to have some investment decision go bad, which then increases the probable risk of this occurring to my finances. And this means that I need to plan for this. To be able to plan for this, what do I need to know? I want to know how my life will be impacted should this risk materialize. How prepared am I today to be able to deal with this? And finally, what can I do in advance to actually better manage it if it happens? To unpack this further, I understand that a bad investment decision will impact my lifestyle choices. I won't be taking that beach holiday I've been planning for or buy those expensive shoes. And maybe I can no longer even go to my daily yoga classes. Basically, a lot of the things that bring me joy and happiness. But before I give up all of this, I want to understand do I have the coping capacity to protect myself if this actually happens? Do I have other means through which I can compensate my bad investment decision? Do I have savings? Do I have a social support system where I can borrow from while I work on recovering my losses? With all these questions and all this information, what do you think I've done? To put it simply, I've done a short risk assessment to plan my finances. And if I was to go a step further, plan my lifestyle choices. I've identified the possible risks to my finances. I've undertaken an exposure analysis of what parts of my life will be impacted should the risk materialize. And finally, I've taken a vulnerability assessment to understand what my coping capacity would be in a financially constrained time. Now, the fundamental question really is, what do I do with all this information? How do I prepare for such a rainy day? Maybe I'd reduce my risk by investing in safer options. Maybe I save more, or maybe I build up access to credit. Or maybe I do a combination of all of this. Ultimately, the decision I make is based on a number of different things. How risk averse am I? What do I value in life? And finally, what choices can I actually afford? Over the next few hours, over the next hour, we'll hear about how these concepts and ideas are applied to different problems and different actors who are also trying to manage and understand their own risks. Just like I understand what I'm exposed to, countries follow a very similar process to make these decisions and help plan and protect their budgets, their business, and their people. We'll hear about how risk information helps design regional solutions for countries that have similar risks but different exposure levels and coping capacities. We'll also hear about data gaps. Countries often don't have the kind of information you have to plan your finances. Satellites can play a role here. We'll also hear about how information helps prioritize public assets and, in fact, protect them when they're most needed after a disaster. And finally, we'll also hear about the value of public expenditures for how these can help with designing better financial planning. Finally, we'll work together to communicate these ideas and understand how countries can better protect themselves from fiscal shocks. So on that note, get ready to use your 5th and 11th grade math brains to hear about how risk assessments can help drive policy decisions for financial planning. Thank you.
Thank you, Sumati. So that was really interesting, and we learned from Sumati's own personal experience on the importance of risk financing and assessment, and how this helps us make better, stronger decisions, whether we're looking at it from a policy standpoint or even planning our own finances. So this is broad and multidimensional, and as Sumati discussed, over the next hour, we will investigate several aspects of this topic through our paired short presentations. So our first pair today is going to be Benedict Signer and Shannon Chua. And Benedict is going to talk to us about financial risk management of public assets. And Shannon will take us through her impactful work on this in the Philippines. Benedict is a program coordinator with the Disaster Risk Financing and Insurance Program, which is part of the FCI global practice at the World Bank, and has supported 20 countries to actively manage potential losses from climate and disaster shocks. Shannon is a member of the Capital Market Strategy and Planning Division of the Bureau of Treasury in the Philippines. And as part of this team, she's helped with the issuance of local and international sovereign bond issuances such as Panda bonds, Samurai bonds, and retail treasury bonds. So I'm very excited to welcome Benedict and Shannon to present our first pair of short presentations today. Over to you, Benedict.
Thank you, Kavya. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, everyone, wherever you are. What I want to do is to use 5 minutes to give a brief framework, just to put you all in the right frame of mind to listen to Shannon's presentation afterwards, and hopefully also to leave something with you, some questions with you for the next presentations afterwards and the next sessions as well. So see this as a framing presentation, and see this as something you ask questions from, something to take away of how to maybe best deploy your skills in support of governments in that kind of program that Shannon will be presenting. So if we start on the next slide, we start on the big picture. Why are we talking about public assets? It's don't have to spend a lot of time on this, but just to set it out. And if you can move to the next slide. We all know the need for investments in infrastructure and public assets. That's one estimate from the Global Infrastructure Facility, I believe it is, that between now and 2040, so over 20 years, the world needs to invest 94 trillion US dollars in infrastructure just to maintain growth and reduce poverty. Now, that's a huge amount of investment, and that's a huge amount of new infrastructure. The problem, of course, is that this infrastructure will be exposed to disasters. And if we move to the next slide, these are estimates from the World Bank, where just looking at energy and transport services, so just two sectors in low middle income countries globally, the estimates are that every year those countries face cost of disruption and damages in excess of 400 billion US dollars. And it's important to pull apart these costs of disruptions and damages very briefly. So there's actually, in these estimates, less than $20 billion every year are from the physical damage to assets. And more than the 380 billion US dollars are really from the cost of disruption to services. So say your energy system goes down, your grid is disrupted, companies can no longer produce, hospitals are shut off, roads are destroyed, you lose access to markets for companies, etc. So this is really a huge economic impact as well. Now, what can you do about this? And this is where we start getting a bit more narrow, and of course, a key topic of this conference. On the next slide, you'll see standard risk management framework, standard risk management strategy. Most of you will have seen this in some form or another. You can avoid risk, you can reduce risk. We're not talking about this today, hugely important, but you have many, many other sessions touching on this. We're really looking at this second part, the how to manage this residual risk that you cannot avoid or cannot reduce. And there you have two parts. You can either retain the cost, manage it as part of your budget, or you can share or insure, so transfer the cost to somebody else. Now, both of those actions or activities, they serve two main objectives. We move to the next slide. One objective, the primary objective, is protect society by ensuring that the money is available to respond quickly, that you can restore services as quickly as possible. You can move generators into place, for example, temporary transformers. You can rebuild a road, a temporary road, at least as quickly as possible. So really that society can get back to functioning as quickly, as efficiently as possible. The second key point is to protect the government's balance sheet and more efficiently manage the cost that the government does not face unexpected expenditures or large unexpected expenditures. But how do you go about this? So you go to the next slide. Designing and developing a public asset risk financing program, in order to know how to design it, how to develop it, how to set it up, launch it, and manage it, it requires a lot of data, which is what we're talking about today. And you see, starting from the left, starts with pretty high level data, location of assets, gets more specific, types of building, characteristics of building, what is the change of those buildings, infrastructure, and assets over time. So all of this requires information. And I'll give you one example. You see the next slide. This is the kind of information that a commercial property underwriter is looking for. You can go to the next slide. So this is what someone in the insurance market is looking for when they're saying, well, I'm receiving interest. Somebody wants to insure assets with me. Those are the things I'm looking for, saying, well, how risky is it? How much should I charge for this? Can I even insure it? On the left, you see the minimum information looking for. On the right, the ideal nice to have. But the reality is, in fact, most governments are struggling with much more basic information. See the next slide, you can pull that up. That it's information just like, where are my assets even, right? Is it which state, which province, which city, maybe district, zip code, postcode, address, fantastic, geolocation, very rarely. So really where we are and where we should be for efficient risk management is a huge divergence. So this is just one of the examples. We could do this deep dive in many of those other asset information fields or characteristics, but just one to give you a sense of the difference between reality and where it should be. And if you move to the last slide, please, this is what I want to leave with you. No matter whether you come from financial side or whether you come from a data side, risk assessment side, engineering side, try and think, what are the very simple, small things you can do to make it easier for governments to help manage the risk better? Not brand new technology solutions, but how can you just fill a small gap along the way? Those are some questions. There are many others you could ask as well. So try and think back about your own work and how you can apply that to whatever you hear today and over the next couple of days. Thank you.
Handing over to Shannon, please.
Hi, good evening, good morning, good afternoon. So where I am, it's actually evening, bordering morning. So this presentation is just how we in government actually make use of different types of data to assess what kind of risk that we're willing to take and what kind of risk that we know we ought to transfer. So next slide, please. So in the Philippines, I've cited just a couple of the data sources that we use in Bureau of the Treasury. So first is the National Asset Registry System. Basically, this system is where we try to get strategically important assets of the Philippines and we try to collect their data and compile it. And well, it's a work in progress right now, but we're trying to see what kind of information we can get from our different agencies and to help us make more informed decisions as to where government assets actually are. The second item here, the National Disaster Risk Reduction and Management Council reports. These are done every time there's a disaster that happens. So whether it's a typhoon, an earthquake, a volcanic eruption, the NDRRMC would publish data, whether it's a situational report or their rapid assessment. And this data would show you what are the damages to infrastructure and agriculture done because of that event, where that damage is, and what is their assessment as to the cost of that damage. Next is the DOST GeoRisk PH platform. This is actually quite new and it's done by our Department of Science and Technology. What they tried to do is they got information from our weather agencies and our volcanic agency and tried to put it in the Philippine map so that you can go to their website and visualize. Okay, if I live in 123 Street, ABC, City, and DEF province, what is actually my risk there, right? So you could see how far you are from the nearest volcano. You could see whether you are going to be susceptible to flooding, or even if in case the sea level would rise, whether your town or your city would actually be submerged. Next is the AIR catastrophe model. This model was what we actually used for two of our projects before. So one is the catastrophe bond and the other is the parametric insurance. On the side, you can see two photos, right? And these are just some of the outputs of the catastrophe model. So the catastrophe model for the typhoon risk could show you easily that our eastern seaboard, the very red area there, is the one that's most hit by typhoons. And then when you look at our earthquake, you can see that the risk for earthquake is actually quite spread out, but mainly towards the middle, that's actually the Manila Fault. And that's where not just a lot of properties are, but also if it does move, the risk there is quite high. All of these data, though, are work hand in hand to provide us our DRF strategy. So if we could go to the next slide. So what we try to do is not just use one data set. We try to see overall what kind of risk exposure the Philippines has, because we want to make sure that when we have a strategy in place, that it can address various levels of risk. So we have right now risks that we retain through our contingent financing and disaster funds, and we have risks that we transfer. Risks that we transfer, whether it's through parametric insurance, catastrophe bonds, or even indemnity insurance. Next slide, please. So for indemnity insurance, we actually make use of the National Asset Registry System. And our National Asset Registry System basically collates data from different agencies, and we try to get information such as their location, the replacement cost, the condition they're in, risk mitigating features, and even the year they were constructed. It started out as Excel, It's still technically in Excel, but we're moving forward to make it an online-based system. Next slide, please. So this is just a snapshot of what some of the items we have are. And in the red box are actually key things that we wanted to make sure we had, especially for our indemnity insurance program. So this would be the location information, financial information, and insurance information. Next slide, please. So this National Asset Registry, it's definitely still a work in progress, and we have many plans for it. We hope to interface with different government agencies. We hope to standardize and adopt various data standards, and then we want to make sure it's easy and simple to use. Next slide, please. But what are some challenges, right? And I think this is common for a lot of governments. It's really hard to find data. It's hard to coordinate with agencies. It's hard to gather it all up. It's also hard when you do get the data, the quality, it's not always that good, but you have to start somewhere. It's also hard for government because we don't have data scientists in place. We don't have risk modelers. So what we would recommend, like as government, is that there really has to be capacity building, analytics summary, because it's gonna take quite long for us to try to look at all of these different data sets. And for someone who's very new at it, it's gonna take a long time to understand. And even having interactive tools such as like an Excel that you can work around and play with, that's very helpful for government. And that's what we found very useful when we were doing that catastrophe modeling of AIR. And of course, the leveling of information. At the national government level, you won't need that much information. So thank you.
Bhavya, you're on mute.
Sorry.
Hi,
Thanks,
can you hear-
Shannon. That was incredibly useful and a really great way to bring to light Benedict's previous presentation on the topic. So moving closer to where Understanding Risk should have been hosted this year physically, our next pair of Ignite presenters are going to talk to us about Southeast Asia Disaster Risk Insurance Facility, otherwise known as CDRIF. We'll first start with Gary Ryson, who is the Executive Director and a board member of CDRIF. Formerly, Gary was the Chief Executive Officer and Executive Chairman at Steamship Mutual. He spent most of his career at Steamship Mutual, where he started as a lawyer, advising on legal issues affecting ship owners, and most recently as the Chief Executive Officer and Executive Chairman. Following Gary, we will have Kathy. Kathy is a financial sector specialist at the Crisis and Disaster Risk Financing team, and she primarily works with governments and international organizations to support better financial planning and help them build resilience to protect the most vulnerable from disasters. Her projects are spread across the Caribbean, Southeast Asia, Africa, and the Pacific region. And Kathy is going to talk to us about the CDRIF flood monitoring tool. So definitely stay tuned, and you will have the opportunity to learn much more about it in our small group discussions. But for now, over to Gary.
Thank you very much. CDRIF is an initiative of the Asian +3 countries, and its purpose is to enhance financial resilience against disaster and climate shocks. And the way it does this is by providing insurance solutions and also advisory services. And really, I've only got time to touch on two aspects. One is to talk to you a little bit about the governance structure of CDRIF, and then secondly, to very briefly give you an overview of the insurance products that CDRIF Insurance Company is giving. So if we could go to the next slide, please, and look at the governance structure. And if we can go to the next one, thank you very much. If we go back one, the CDRIF Trust consists of the Council of Members, the member countries, and any of the Asian countries can join. And this is really the body that provides the strategic decision making for the organization. And it's administered by a trustee, which is a professional management company you can see on the left-hand side. The lead technical partner is the World Bank, and the ASEAN Secretariat acts as the secretarial. The Seadrift Trust has set up one subtrust A, and the purpose of subtrust A is to own the Seadrift Insurance Company, and also to provide overall supervision and guidance for the insurance company. You'll see to the right of subtrust A that there are further subtrusts. They don't exist at the moment, but they're an indication that Seadrift has been set up with the flexibility to provide further products in due course. At the moment, the Seadrift Insurance Company is providing a product which is a flood product, and it has 2 member countries at the moment, 2 countries that it's providing insurance to, and that's Myanmar and Laos. And I should say that actually we're not operational as of today. This project has been several years in the making, and the hope is that by the end of this year, the first insurance policies will be issued. If we could go on to the next slide, please. And that's what I've been talking about, that the first product is a cat risk pool. It's a flood risk insurance policy. If we could go on to the next slide, please. And this slide really is a high-level analysis of the insurance product. The insurance policies will be divided into 2. There'll be a parametric section, which we've already touched on, and the purpose of having a parametric insurance is really to provide very quick payouts to the member countries. So there are set amounts and there are set trigger points, and those trigger points are going to be discussed by Kathy. They're set out really, and they follow the flood risk tool which has been developed. There is also another section which is called the finite section, which is not a very informative heading, but what it intends to do is to really pick up losses which are not covered under the parametric insurance policy, and that may be for a number of reasons. And the kinds of things which are covered under the finite section are agreed in advance and set out in the insurance policy. It's agreed with the member country as to what events and what kind of things they want covered under that policy. So that's where we've got to so far. And with that, I'll hand over to Kathy, who's going to talk about the flood risk monitoring tool.
Great, thanks Gary for that introduction to Seadrift as a platform within Southeast Asia. So I'm going to provide a brief overview of the Seadrift flood monitoring tool, which acts as the trigger methodology for the first insurance product, which Seadrift, as Gary mentioned, is hoping to issue by the end of this year. And so the first insurance product is a parametric flood scheme for Myanmar and Laos. And so a parametric flood scheme, as opposed to an indemnity one, is where a hazard trigger or an index trigger is used. And once that threshold is breached, say, for example, if you were doing it as a wind, it could be if a wind speed is breached, or an earthquake could be a certain size of earthquake event is breached, then a payout is made. And I'll talk through how we've done that for flood within this talk. And the flood monitoring tool that we discuss here is what is used as that trigger methodology, but it's also important because it's providing disaster risk management by greater access to flood maps, satellite imagery, as well as other real-time data sources for the governments of Myanmar and Laos as well. So if we could just quickly move to the next slide, that'd be great. So unfortunately, due to internet issues, very much from my end, we're not able to show you the online platform interactively or demonstrate it. So I just have a screenshot of one of the pages here. So this screenshot shows some satellite data from September 2019. And what you can see here is some of the light blue areas, which indicate where there is flooding ongoing. And you can see some of the darker blue areas, which indicate permanent water bodies. And I wanted to highlight this one quickly, really, just before I go into the detail, to mention that within Southeast Asia and Asia in particular, there is an added kind of difficulty in a sense, which is that you have a lot of rice fields and paddy fields. So one of the things that was very important with the way this tool works was to give a way of indicating which areas are flooded permanently, or certainly for a significant amount of the year, but actually we would anticipate that those should be flooded. They're not going to have any adverse effects. And in fact, those areas shouldn't be counted in terms of causing issues or damage towards Myanmar and Laos, which would result in them receiving a payout. So on this slide here, you can see, which is what someone can log into, one of the members of Myanmar and Laos, you can see information about the total number of people affected, which is actually the index that we use to trigger payouts on the left-hand side. This is just an example from 2019. So you can see about 500,000 people were deemed as affected here. And then also additional information on the districts. So we have Yangon, Bago, and Yangon East and West, that have been split into, to give an idea of the number of people affected in different districts. Now this shows some of the satellite information, but on the next slide, I'll discuss the different varieties and sources of data which go into the system. It's also great to see that I think joining, I can see in those participants that actually have members from both JBA and CHIMA who were strong partners in the development of this tool who've been able to join. And hopefully they might be able to join the breakout session as well, and perhaps provide any answers to any detailed questions which you might have. This is going to be a whistle-stop tour of the tool and mainly focus on the satellite imagery part, which is really the new and innovative part of the system. But the tool basically needs to provide a continuous view of flooding in Myanmar and Laos in order to be able to trigger the reinsurance and insurance payouts at any time of year. And it does this by continually absorbing satellite imagery, operational weather model information, such as how much precipitation, rainfall is forecast throughout the year, as well as gauge data. So this gauge data could be monitoring the flood levels in a river, the discharge levels, or perhaps coastal levels from surges, which can happen when you have a tropical cyclone in the region. And what we do is combine that with information which was pre-built into the model, which is a set of flood maps. And now these flood maps indicate the depth and area which we'd expect to be inundated when you have a certain amount of river flow, say in the Irrawaddy or in the Mekong, or when we have a certain amount of precipitation which has happened. So if you could go on to the next slide, please. Great. So the slide before, if possible. Thanks very much. So as I said, the flood tool automatically retrieves this data. So it receives input from the ECMWF, which is on the amount of rainfall. This is then fed into a global hydrological model, which tells you how much, you expect this precipitation to do on the ground through a river routing model. And then we have the satellite information. So effectively, and this is, as I say, a very quick tour, knowing we only have a few minutes, it combines all this information to select the best possible flood map for each sub-area, which is an area which you expect to have the same kind of flood situation going on within the country. And it creates a mosaic, so effectively a national level representation of where the system believes flooding is ongoing in the country. This flood map is then overlaid with a population database to give an indication of the number of people who are affected by flooding. And if you could just move on to the next slide. I know we're running a bit short on time, but I just wanted to highlight the satellite imagery. So one of the great, I think, innovations and leading technical parts of this is the use of satellite data in the system. So we've been supported by ESA and the Sentinel-1 satellite, which provides radar imagery data throughout this project. And the benefit of the radar data is that it's able to see through clouds effectively. It's not affected by cloud cover, which is what you get for visible imagery. And so we're able to get a good extent of where flooding is ongoing, even under monsoon conditions, when you'd expect there's a significant amount of flooding. And CDRIF uses this through an algorithm which is developed by the Luxembourg Institute of Science and Technology and implemented through CHIMA, and it's able to continuously monitor where flooding is that wasn't previously. I've got a few additional slides, but noting that we're running out of time, I'd hopefully go through those on the in the longer section. But if we just move to the final slide, so if we quickly run through, that would be great, to the very end. So that I can show you on the breakout session, but just demonstrates how we match different flood maps. But I really wanted to show is the population affected metric. So what's very important about any insurance scheme and parametric scheme is that it focuses on where there is the highest amount of exposure. And in the case of supporting governments, we want them to be able to support the people and the population. So if a flood occurs in an area which isn't very densely populated, then there is less of a need for the reinsurance to pay out and for the government to receive money to help with the relief system. But if we have a lot of payout, a lot of people affected, then it might be a smaller flood, but actually more people live in those areas. That's the kind of opportunities that we want to target to be able to help beneficiaries with these payouts. And so we do that by overlaying the flood maps with a population database. And this population database is actually the World Population Database, which is widely used throughout the scientific community and also combines remotely sensed data and geospatial data sets. So again, making broader use of remote sensing and satellite data to produce population maps globally, but obviously we focus on Myanmar. And then the important point, just to make it very focused on, to ensure it focuses, it is a national and global data set, but to use information at the country level, is to use census data supported by the government to ensure it all aligns with what they know about their population, rather than using a kind of globally calibrated data set. So I know that was a very rapid whistle-stop tour, but hopefully we'll meet some of you in the breakout room later and we can discuss in more detail. Great.
Thank you, Kathy and Gary. That was very interesting, and you will have the chance to interact more with them, as Kathy said, in our small group discussions, so do stay tuned. Our next pair of presenters will talk to us about a different kind of data on public spending on disasters and crisis, and present some new research on how public finances are impacted by disasters. We will first have Tatiana Scallon, who will discuss about why we need to know how much governments spend on disasters and speak to us about the world's first public expenditure reviews focusing on post-disaster spending. Following Tatiana, we'll have Stephanie Allen, who will brief us on ongoing research on the impact of COVID-19 on public expenditure in 4 countries, with an emphasis on opportunity cost of public sector budget reallocations. So definitely very timely, given what all of us have been going through over the last few months. Tatiana works in the crisis and disaster risk financing team, and she's based out of London, UK. Along with her team, she works with governments in strengthening their financial preparedness to natural disasters and crisis. Her key projects are in the regions of Europe and Central Asia, South Asia, East Asia, and Pacific, and includes countries like Albania, Serbia, Pakistan, and the Philippines. Stephanie is a senior consultant with Oxford Policy Management's Public Financial Management team, where she's provided direct technical support to ministries of finance and line ministries in South Sudan, Myanmar, Ethiopia, and Lebanon. So without much further ado, I'm handing over to Tatiana.
Thank you, Kavya. So as Kavya mentioned, during these 2 brief presentations, we will talk about very different types of data, so data on government spending. And I'll just very quickly outline why do we need data and what are we doing about that. So on the next slide, let me start with a very well-known fact. So government resources are limited, and COVID made it worse. It made this more acute, but it is always the case. So it is very important to know whether governments use public funds effectively and efficiently. But the question comes is how do we evaluate this? How do we understand whether they spend them effectively and efficiently? And there are basically 3 components of this formula. So we need one to know the input. So in our case, we want to know how much money the government spent. We want to understand how this leads to specific outputs. For instance, how many houses are being constructed after disasters with these investments, and to what outcomes eventually this leads, such as, for instance, well-being of people living in these houses. However, there is this huge global evidence gap on how much governments actually spend on disasters. And the interesting fact is, this is the case also for governments themselves. They often lack this evidence. For instance, the government of the Philippines, they have this very comprehensive audit reports of the disaster funds, But even despite being so comprehensive, these audit reports, they only cover 25% of the utilization of their key source of post-disaster financing, their National Disaster Reserve Fund. And there are many reasons for that. I mean, post-disaster financing process is complex. There are many multiple agencies, if not all government agencies involved in response and reconstruction and recovery after disasters. Disaster risk financing process is stretched over many years, so you need to have a reporting that is able and capable to capture such a timeline. And some of the spending are embedded in regular budget lines. So for instance, the Ministry of Transport would use the operations and maintenance budgets to, for instance, rehabilitate the roads. I mean, besides not knowing whether the government spends public funds effectively and efficiently, there are other problems to that. And on the next slide, I outline some of the key questions, not an exhaustive list. Penny, if you could move to the next slide, please. Yeah, thanks. So just to think about, for instance, risk reduction. If you want to understand as a government whether you invest enough in risk reduction, sorry, the previous slide, Penny. Yeah. If you want to understand as a government whether you invest in risk reduction, so if you understand how much you spend after disasters, if you want to understand to which extent you want to reduce risk, to which extent you want to strengthen, for instance, your buildings, you want to understand how much risk you will eventually retain. If you think about, for instance, risk financing, governments often want to, construct this disaster risk financing strategy, understanding how different instruments, these financing instruments, can work together. For instance, they want to place a disaster reserve fund, but to understand how to allocate adequate amount of financing to this fund, you want to understand how much you spend. So you want to understand how, let's say, disaster damages eventually translate into public spending. So on the next slide, what you see is the solution. So the solution, of course, is building evidence. So about a year ago, we started and now almost finished first of its kind public expenditure review of post-disaster spending in the Philippines. And there are two similar exercises done in Indonesia and Kenya as we speak. So the public expenditure reviews, or the PRs, are quite well-established methodology at the World Bank. And they help to basically understand how public spending help achieve certain government priorities. But in our case, this was just let's say, first step. And our key objective was really to establish this fundamental knowledge and let's say, pave the way to further studies and to further research into the area. So with this PR, we are still unable to say whether, for instance, Department of Public Works and Highways spent better in 2015 versus 2018, but we did have some very interesting findings, which we will discuss in more details during the breakout group. So yeah, so we identified some bottlenecks and some ineffectiveness as well. And on the last slide to finish this presentation with, just to remind that, so public budgets in most of the countries are the primary sources of covering post-disaster costs. And more work needs to be done to close this evidence gap and to understand how much the governments actually spend on disasters. And there are several components to that. And just to name the few, for instance, we need to know the cross-country evidence that was very much missing when we were doing our PER. We would like to understand more about progress and changes, how the situation changed over time. And another key component which links to the next presentation is it is very important to understand budget reallocation process, because we had a lot of anecdotal evidence in the PR in the Philippines that governments reallocate, they shift budgets to cover disaster costs. For instance, a department would be waiting for the reserve fund money to come in, and in the meantime, they would shift the budget within their agency. Now, the point is these spending eventually are not reflected very well, and we don't know exactly what share of post-disaster costs they would cover. So it's very important to also look at that and understand. So over to Stephanie now, who will talk a little bit in more details what is done on this last point.
Thank you, Tatiana. for that nice segue. So we're going to talk to you about some expenditure analysis we're doing specifically in relation to COVID-19, and it's working across 4 countries. With support from the Centre for Disaster Protection, we're looking at Pakistan and South Africa. With the World Bank, we're looking at Albania, and with FCDO funding, we're also looking at Ethiopia. So next slide. Just to cover a little bit on the rationale, why are we doing this study? I'm sure as many of you listening in today will know, the DRF literature will often point to significant costs of disasters for a state, for a government. And these costs are direct, but they're also indirect. And often when we talk about those indirect costs, we will mention the opportunity cost of budget reallocations. So just as Tatiana was saying, the first port of call is often to raid your own budget to finance disaster relief and recovery. But while this rings very true and it's supported with a lot of anecdotal evidence, there's a real lack of quantitative evidence out there on the scale of these budget reallocations and also the longer lasting impacts, for instance, on growth and development. So for instance, if we thought that capital expenditure was delayed or postponed, what's the impact of that, and can we include that in our overall comprehensive assessment of the cost of disasters? Why is there this gap in evidence? Well, it's because it's not very obvious to work this out. It's often poorly documented. You need really detailed financial expenditure information that usually isn't reported publicly by the government. And also what decisions were made and why is often forgotten after the crisis abates. So we are using the opportunity of COVID-19 as a live case study for us to analyse public expenditure decisions with a focus of what wasn't spent as a result of the pandemic. So if I can go on to the next slide, please. This is in very broad terms, our methodology, and I'm not going to go into detail, but my colleague Dana will in the breakout session if anybody wants to kind of quiz us on this in a bit more detail. But just to quickly say that we're starting with a financial landscaping in these 4 countries. So we're asking what financing modalities were available to the different governments, because obviously that will have an impact on how much they would need to reallocate from their existing budget. So for instance, some countries can take on more debt, whereas for others, we know it's not an option. So once we've done that financial landscaping, we've tried to build a counterfactual, and that's been great fun to do. It's basically us trying to say, what would public expenditure in this country have looked like if the COVID-19 pandemic hadn't occurred? Once we've built that, we're comparing that against actual expenditures. So we're looking at outturn data, and then we can see which programs, which sectors have received budget increases and which have been forced to cut. And then to add to this, we're doing a procedural analysis. So this is trying to understand the PFM processes that guided those decisions and how those changed over the course of the emergency. So what decisions were made in the preparation stage versus what decisions were made in response and recovery. And the final piece of the pie is the impact analysis. So once we've got a clear picture of exactly which budget lines are cut, we're trying to work out what the impact of those cuts are in terms of losses that have been foregone. So if I could move on to the final slide, just to say that this is very much an ongoing piece of research. It will be a long-term study, but we already have some emerging findings, and I'm just going to pick up a couple of them for you. My colleague Dana will talk through the rest in the breakout if you want more detail. But to start with this, it bears repeating that there's a no regrets approach to the first cuts. So we've seen everywhere that there are some expenditures that are just not viable after an emergency. So for example, in South Africa, tourism reduced. The first thing that the government cut was advertisements for tourism. So that makes perfect sense. In Pakistan and Albania, the government offices were closed, and so the first cuts were operational budgets around those. Nobody is arguing with that. It's once those kind of no regrets options are exhausted, then you have to make the more difficult trade-offs. Another point that I think is quite interesting is probably COVID, more so than any other disasters, has more uncertainty associated with it. And ministries of finance are no different in that respect in dealing with that uncertainty. And so what we've seen is actually quite volatile decision making that is being played out in resource allocations. If you look at this chart on the slide, it's for the Ministry of Infrastructure and Energy. We see in the first two supplementary budgets, they had their budgets cut. And then in the third supplementary budget, there was an increase in resources, so their funding increased, reinstating some of those earlier cuts. In the interest of time, I'm going to close on one positive point, which is that actually this has also been an impetus for quite difficult PFM reforms that otherwise may not have been possible for political reasons. So for instance, in Albania, they've now introduced a law that the primary balance cannot fall below 0 from 2023. In South Africa, there's been a long discussion about the need for fiscal consolidation, but no progress. And finally, they're making progress on that. In Ethiopia, they're now looking seriously about how to increase their really poor revenue performance. And in Pakistan, there's this long-standing practice where the federal government can appoint political appointees to the provincial governments. And for the first time, the provincial governments have had a reason to actually push back on this and say, we can't afford this given the current circumstances. So to conclude, the emerging framework, what we're finding is, first of all, cut unviable expenditures. Second of all, trim the pay bill, which is normally just not filling empty positions. And then after that, that's when you're cutting capital and associated operating and maintenance costs with the significant impact on future growth and development. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And as Tatiana and Stephanie said, you will have the opportunity to join them and learn a little more about this very timely and interesting work. Thank you. So I'm going to tell you a short story. I was in my first year of college when the 2004 tsunami hit Chennai. And I was studying computer science at that time. And overnight, my computer lab was completely washed away by the tsunami. So there I was at home for 6 months when I couldn't go to college, and I had to change my major from computer science to arts, which is why I'm actually here today talking to you about risk financing rather than being a software engineer as I originally intended to be when I first started my career so many years ago. So no matter how you are going to be using or talking about a lot of the technical concepts we just heard, it's very important to build and talk about your risk financing story and narrative. Next slide, please. Over the next 5 minutes, I will be giving you 5 quick tips on building your risk financing story and your risk assessment story. The first, use what you know. I started with my own story. I do a lot of trainings for the crisis and disaster risk financing team. And whenever I talk about the impact of climate and disasters on people, this is something which comes to my mind because I've lived it, I understand it. And while this was a minor impact, it personally affected me. And just to think about how this would affect everybody else and people in different stratas of society, it really illustrates and brings out the point of disaster risk financing and assessment. Using what you know and speaking from your own experience helps you find your voice very quickly, because who else can speak about your experience better than you, and also helps you connect to your audience. Next slide, please. Create a shared experience. So remember, while I was talking about my story, how I brought it back to today and at this time and at this webinar about how we are now speaking together about building a risk financing narrative. Creating that shared space with your audience is a great way to engage people and connect with them because you're talking about something people care. You're now talking about something both people are experiencing. So think about who you're speaking with. So is your audience an audience who's very interested in climate change? So start your story from a climate change angle. Or are you talking to someone a senior at a professional setting who just wants the key points? Then talk through the highlights. Or are you talking to a big group of data people? Then exfoliate on the data points. Next slide, please. So how much preparation is a good amount of preparation to tell a story? It's very important to prepare in advance, because if you don't think of your story and your narrative in advance, then we speak on and on and on with no start and no finish. A good rule of thumb, which I use, is the 80-20 rule. So you do 80% preparation on your story ahead of time and leave 20% flexibility based on the room and what you're reading from the room. If you see people suddenly get interested when you're talking about your personal experiences, talk more about that. Or if you see people get excited when they talk about a case study, then extrapolate on that. For example, in today's presentation, Benedict spoke about how he was setting the scene for Shannon's presentation later. And that really brought to life the technical concepts he spoke about. So having this 20% flexibility allows you to have a smoother narrative and seem more authentic, seem more with the flow, which really endears your audience towards you and attracts them to listen to you. Next slide, please. Be clear and concise when you're giving your narrative. Remember that every story, and no matter what you say, there are key takeaways, and build in flux points around these key takeaways. So think about a movie or a television serial, and just when you know something bad's going to happen, you hear da 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 on the screen, or the tempo changes, and then suddenly you know that something interesting is going to happen, and the movie sets the scene for that. Think about doing something similar with your narrative. You don't really need to make background noises, but you can start building the tempo of what you're speaking about so that people pay attention. Know when to start and know when to stop your story. Very often, people have this huge presentation and then say, in conclusion, the moral is, and then moralize for 5 more minutes after that. And you've already lost your audience at the point. Knowing your start and stop points are very, very important. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Next, yes, thank you. So now this is my 5th and my most important point on building a narrative. Now, the magic of storytelling lies in story listening, which means you want your audience to listen and take away something from it and act on it. So be clear on what action you want your audience to do after the story. So remember, when I started out today's presentation, I said, no matter what you're going to do with all this information on risk assessment, here are some ways in which you can build your narrative around that. So that's the clear action I would like you to take from today's presentation. Talk about what you heard, discuss it with your colleagues, talk about it to the presenters in your small group discussions. It's very important to have a clear takeaway and give your audience that ability to have a concrete next step. So in conclusion, I'm going to go through the 5 short points on building a risk financing and risk assessment narrative. Number 1, use what you know. Number 2, create a shared experience with your audience. Number 3, the rule of 80-20, 80% preparation, 20% flexibility. Number 4, be clear and concise about your key takeaways and ensure that you're explicit about them. And the last tip, which is the magic of storytelling, lies in story listening. All right, so as we come to the end of the first section today, we're now going to have the exciting opportunity to join small breakout groups and chat with the presenters from today. You will have the option to choose 1 out of 3 technical breakout groups. They're going to be 30-minute breakout groups and then a 10-minute report back. So we have the first breakout group on public asset insurance. We have the second breakout group on CDRIF and the flood monitoring. And then we have the third breakout group on public expenditure reviews. So you should see on your screen a way to join the breakout groups. We will start the breakout groups at 11 in about 10 minutes exactly. So currently it is 11 a.m. EST, and we will start at 11:10 a.m. EST. So no matter where you are, you have about 5 minutes to join the breakout rooms. Penny, do you have any further instructions on joining the breakout rooms?
Hi. So everyone, please look at the lower button of your screen and click on, as Kavya said, click on the breakout rooms and choose one of the three topics, one of the three breakout rooms to join. I can see some of the colleagues already successfully joining.
Okay. So it just came to my attention that some of you don't see the breakout room button. If you do not see that, at the bottom of your screen, you will see a more button right next to reactions. And if you click on the more, there's an option which allows you to join a breakout room. So we're going to start in about 10 minutes, just so that we can ensure everybody has.
So for the colleagues who just joined us, we are currently using the break time to let everybody join for breakout sessions. Please click on the icon at the lower button of your screen to click breakout rooms and choose one of the three breakout room topics. And the breakout room will start at 11:10 a.m. EST. If you cannot see the breakout room icon, you can click 3 dots, which indicates it's more, and then click, and you will see the drop-down menu, and then click the breakout room choices. Welcome back to the main session, everyone.
Thanks, Penny. And just this is Kathy, just from my side. Apologies, Gary. I hadn't realised the session was just about to end, and I know you were right in the middle of answering a question from within our session. But
probably good to cut me short.
Thanks.
While we are waiting for everybody to come back from the different breakout groups, we're going to ask for one volunteer from each group to just do a quick 30-second recap. So it looks like we have most of our breakout group participants. Just going to give it 30 seconds more. So welcome back, everybody. Welcome back to the main session. And sorry if some of the breakout groups got cut. We're still trying to work out all the technical kinks with Zoom, and we're learning as we go on. But I did have the wonderful opportunity to actually hop between the different breakout rooms, and there were some very interesting discussions going on. So it seemed like that was very good. And so welcome back. We're at the last 5 minutes of today's event, and just before we go into any report back from the breakout room, a quick plug-in for the Disaster Risk Financing Community of Practice. At the side of your screen, you'll see a QR code. If you're not already a member of the DRF Community of Practice, please do join us. We regularly have events like this. We send a newsletter. We have a large community of professionals. We have over 5,000 people in our community of practice, so we'd really love for you to join and continue the conversation. Ken, just to start a quick report back, and I asked the first group, which is the CDRIF and the flood monitoring, if somebody would like to do a quick 30-second report on the key takeaways from this group.
So it seems, Kathy, that it will be me, or who's going to be?
Yeah, I've nominated Roberto, who was very vocal in a very positive way in our session, who can introduce himself in his relation to the flood monitoring tool and provide a little roundup of what we discussed. Would be great.
Thank you, Kathy. So yes, I'm Roberto Udari from CIMA Research Foundation. I participated actively in the definition of the flood monitoring tool, as Kathy was already saying in her presentation. When in breakout session, we had the opportunity to see a little bit more in depth, how the tool works. With some additional slides that were shown by Kathy. and some highlights, I mean, especially on, let's say, the good parts, but also the limitations, like, the possibility of using, I mean, additional satellites, for example, or limitation in urban areas from, let's say, the satellite acquisitions. And in that case, I take the opportunity to advertise a talk that I'm going to give tomorrow at the we need champions to understand risk session, exactly on that, on how, I mean, we are trying, I mean, to even improve, I mean, a little bit more what we are doing, I mean, satellite side, I mean, on the tool. There has been discussion about, how to validate the data, how to improve the data, if there would be the needs, I mean, to have a lot of people included on the field, basically, I mean, doing this type of validation. Katie, actually, you were citing, I mean, the flood tags, I mean, methodology also, I mean, for so using crowdsourcing, I mean, to get a little bit more, reality check, I mean, on the ground. So the beauty of it, we discussed that, I mean, is that, I mean, being like a parametric insurance, we don't need too much, I mean, of these reality checks, but it will be used, I mean, reality checks will be used, I mean, to improve definitely the tool. And if we are going towards, I mean, a more, let's say, accurate and precise, more than accurate, I mean, a type of product, we will need, I mean, to think about that, definitely. Another interesting, I mean, point was raised by WMO, Joachim, that mentioned actually the possibility of using this type of methodology and this type of tools, I mean, also for early action. So in a forecast based, we have about, I mean, existing tools, I mean, for example, that are put forward by JBA. And as a final thing, we were talking about, all the possible other uses of either the products or the byproducts of this type of tools for other entities, not just, the insurance world, but also, other actors, let's say, in the disaster risk management arena. And I think that, I mean, both World Bank and CDRIF, I mean, are open, I mean, to this possibility moving forward, and looking forward for this type of possibility, actually. I hope I didn't forget anything important.
That was great. Thanks, Roberto, for that summary.
Thank you so much. So can we move on to the next group, facilitated by Benedict and Shannon on public asset insurance and risk management?
Thanks, Kavya. I actually asked Shannon to report back since everybody was questioning her non-stop. So here's the best overview of all the questions that came in. Give us the 30-second summary.
Okay. So basically during the breakout session, we discussed really how we were able to implement the National Asset Registry system, from data gathering, the tools that we use, and even what we plan to do with the data collected. So first, on data gathering, I think it was very important to highlight during the discussion was that we tried to make use of tools that were available to us. We didn't have a fancy software. We didn't have like expensive gadgets or whatever. We made use of Excel, which is available on everyone's PC or laptop when you're at work. We also made sure that we coordinated. It's very hard to coordinate in the Philippines, especially with having central offices, regional offices, provincial offices, and even district offices in some cases. So there was really that constant communication and constant effort to make sure all of these data were gathered and were refined to a certain degree. We also talked about how we also made sure that the data we're using right now is not just for one program. We're using it for another initiative that we're working on, which is now a whole of government approach to asset management. So this data is not just for in a silo for indemnity insurance, but it's something towards asset planning, asset management of government. And I think the main takeaway from that breakout session was just that getting data on your assets is going to be hard work. And especially for having an insurance scheme that would require all of these data, you need to make sure that you constantly coordinate with these different people and these different agencies to have the data you have. And another thing was having an insurance program in place also takes time and effort. it's not just going to be in the blink of an eye, it's there. It takes time. You need to make sure government is actually on board with it, because it's not just one agency who's going to do an insurance program. You need to get the coordination and the support of your budget committee. They're the ones giving you that budget to actually put that in place. You have to get the go ahead and the support also of the agency whose assets you want, right? So it's really that holistic view that you have to have. You can't just think, oh, okay, I'm Ministry of Finance, that's all I'm going to do. I'm going to make sure I have an insurance program. Because you're not going to be alone in this. It has to be everyone working together.
Thanks, Shannon. That was really helpful. And for the last minute of today's presentation, can we go back to our last group with Tatiana, Dana, and Stephanie, please? Who's reporting back quickly from this group?
I think I am, so no pressure, the final act. So in our breakout group, Tatiana and Dana had a conversation that was kind of sharing lessons from their two expenditure analyses related to disasters. And for me, the kind of takeaways, first of all, public expenditure analysis of this sort is its primary benefit is that it gives a government a more comprehensive estimate of how much a disaster costs them. And that includes opportunity costs from search that Dana. And one key kind of added advantage of this is by having a fuller cost understanding of your reliance on risk retention mechanisms and instruments can actually help build a case for more risk transfer instruments. We also heard in both cases how essential strong government buy-in is. You can't do a public expenditure analysis if the government doesn't want one, because you need really highly disaggregated expenditure information, which often isn't available to the public, or if it is not in the level of detail that we would need for the study. So having the Ministry of Finance on board is critical, and in fact that was a guiding reason for the countries that were selected for the analyses. And then my third takeaway was primarily from the public expenditure reviews that Tatiana talked about. She was finding that they've come up with really useful evidence on the cost of reconstruction, that they can now demonstrate that it's more expensive where the funding is delayed. However, for kind of wider efficiency measures, this is such an emerging field with only a few studies in terms of evidence of this nature. So we don't really have a benchmark to compare across different countries. So she put a call out for more analysis of this type in more countries going forward. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Stephanie. And once again, I'd like to thank all our speakers and our audience for staying with us through this session, and hope all of you have a good rest of the day and enjoy the rest.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye.